Good evening. Welcome to In Conversation with Bettye Kearse and Robert Bland. My name is Casey Fox, and I'm the Director of Advancement for the University of Tennessee Libraries. My co-host this evening is Davis Shoulders, Events Manager for Union Avenue Books here in Knoxville. I'm so happy to see such a terrific crowd. One of the great things about virtual events like this is how they erase geographical barriers. The John C. Hodges Society of the University of Tennessee Libraries has members all across the country who often can't join us for our in-person events here in Knoxville. So it's a pleasure to be able to share this experience with library and book lovers near and far. Tonight, we're also thrilled to be partnering with the UT Black Alumni Council, the UT Division of Diversity and Engagement, and the Office of Multicultural Student Life. The Hodges Society supports the university libraries through monetary gifts, through engagement with library programs, and by raising awareness of the value of the university libraries to the community, to the state, and to researchers around the world. As UT continues to navigate a year that looks very different than any one before, the libraries continue to be a vital resource for students and faculty alike. Our investment in digital resources has ensured we are able to serve every member of the Vol community, no matter where they are. UT Libraries and Union Avenue Books have a great partnership and have so enjoyed co-hosting virtual author events this year. If you value events like this, I encourage you to join the John C. Hodges Society and to shop at Union Avenue Books, Knoxville's independent bookstore. With your support, we can continue to bring world-class authors to local audiences. And now, here's Davis Shoulders to introduce tonight's special guest.
Well, hello, everyone. Again, my name is Davis Shoulders, Events Manager here at Union Ave Books. And just want to start by echoing everything that Casey's already said. Thank you for all the different partners that have come together to set up this program. Obviously, the extended University of Tennessee network, beginning with the Hodges Society, has just been an incredible support for the literary community here and keeping it going through the pandemic. I might also just mention this is the last virtual event we've done this year, and we've relied on a lot of partners like the Hodges Society. We've done things with the University of Tennessee Humanities Center, with the Creative Writing Series, with Choice Health Network Harm Reduction, with IAMS Nature Center, with the bookshop at the bottom, the new Black-owned bookstore in town. And so I think it's just a testament to community and to being able to connect through books in this virtual time. So I just want to send a thanks out to everyone, but especially the Hodges Society for making this possible. And then also just a thank you to customers and that can be whoever you are. You don't have to have been here in the store. Any bookstores are struggling. I think you have heard that. If you're connected to our world, and so we just so appreciate every little connection, every book, every opportunity to share with you what it is that we love, and to hear incredible stories. And I think some of the best books are being published this year in 2020, and they do not need to be overlooked. And the one that we're going to talk about tonight does definitely not need to be overlooked. So this is powering us, making us able to do that, and so. We are overwhelmed with the support in terms of trying to get holiday gifts out to you in time. So we hope that you keep sending them in. So that's just a big heart thank you to everyone who supports independent bookstores, whether they're here or in New Mexico. We may ask Bettye to talk about her bookstore there in New Mexico. But tonight, let's introduce our special guest tonight. This is going to be an incredible story to hear, a story of a family, an American family, an African family, maybe some complicatedness that has gone along with that, and Bettye's journey to understand that. Bettye Kearse is a retired pediatric physician and geneticist. Her writing has appeared in Time, Mental Floss, The Boston Herald, River Teeth, and Black Lives Have Always Mattered, and was listed as a notable in the Best American Essays. And she currently lives in New Mexico. Bettye is going to be joined tonight by none other than the University of Tennessee Professor Robert D. Bland. He's a professor of history and Africana studies at UT Knoxville, and he'll have an upcoming book, which we should pay attention to. I'm sure we'll be selling here at the store, that explores the legacy of Reconstruction in African American Memory and Politics. So without further ado, we'll join me in welcoming Robert and Bettye.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to Knoxville. I'm going to do a short reading, very short, and before that, I'm going to sort of give a quick overview of who I am and how I came to write the book and sort of the adventure of writing the book. But most important, the takeaway message from the book. For more than 30 years, I was a pediatrician in Boston, and I loved it. But I was haunted by the intense feeling that my life's purpose was something else. I found that purpose when I became my family's 8th generation griot, which means I became our oral historian. In 1990, when my mother, our 7th generation griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I asked her, why now? She answered, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I can probably write a book, I thought, but I cannot be the one to hold up the torch of family pride and history. I knew that through their words alone, West African griots and their male counterparts, griots, have preserved entire cultures for thousands of years. And I also knew that kidnapped, enslaved Africans had not left their tradition of oral history behind. Without it, I would not have known that I am a descendant of the enslaved cook, Corrine, and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. My family's credo, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves, has been a source of inspiration and pride for more than 200 years. But when I became the griot, I began to question why the credo should make me proud. For me, it resounded with the abuses of slavery. So in 1992, I began my journey of discovery of my ancestors, our country, and myself. I traveled to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where my family's first African ancestor in America was born, to Baltimore, Maryland, where a replica of a slave ship, like the one that carried her away from home, sits in a museum, to Central Texas, where my enslaved ancestors lived at the time of emancipation, to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered, and to Montpelier, James Madison's former plantation in Virginia. I learned that wherever African slaves once walked, history had tried to erase their footsteps. And I also learned that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of hope by which they survived, and many talents by which they contributed tremendously to America. But here's the best part. When enslaved people died, They did not take those qualities with them to the grave. They passed them down to their descendants, including those of us alive today, including me. They gave me my life's purpose. It is my dream that what my book reveals about enslaved people will inspire young African Americans to embrace their slave ancestry and to grab onto and nurture their own inner strength, their own hopes, their own talents, so that they too can contribute tremendously to America. Thank you. And then I'll just do a really short reading so that there's plenty of time for my conversation with Dr. Bland. Though 4 inches taller than my mother, I felt small next to her. We sat on the sofa, the box between us. Mom leaned back into the pillows, her slender hands delicate, their joints and veins forming intricate angles and planes in her translucent skin. The woman at my side was much more than my mother. She was a woman of ancient times, passing on a legacy for future generations. As she spoke, I reached for her hand and held on to it. Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president, she said. Her thin, high-pitched voice resonated through my living room, repeating the words I had heard so many times, each word lingering in a hint of a Texan drawl. Exactly 30 years ago, she said, when my daddy was very ill, he made me the griot. It tired him out, but over 3 days, he told me all the stories, the ones passed down to him and the ones about his own life. Then, at the end of the 3rd day, he reminded me that our history goes well beyond America's boundaries. What we believe in and what is important to us come from the vastly different beliefs and values people hold in Europe and Africa. And this, she said, searching my eyes, is very important, Betty. Each Rio in our family has to understand that the other Madisons might struggle sometimes to know how to live our lives. But when we share our stories, we build a sense of togetherness and we learn who we are.
Dr. Kearse, I want to first say thank you for joining us virtually in Knoxville this evening. And secondly, I want to thank you again for writing such a richly textured, historically thoughtful and intimate book and sharing your family story with the group. Maybe returning to the point that you began and speaking about what it means to be a griot. And I want to ask you about the question of duty and the kind of the feeling that you received in 1990, receiving the cardboard box, and then recognizing that at some point this is going to go from an oral history to a book that you're potentially sharing with younger generations of African Americans. People are interested in African American history. People are interested in these stories about what the country means and its relationship with enslavement, and the founders' relationship with enslavement. So, to you, what does it mean to be a griot? And what does that duty to you mean to be a griot?
Well, it is quite a responsibility. The responsibility is not only to keep the stories alive and keep the ancestors alive, it's also to pass on the values and beliefs in our family. And I mentioned that in West Africa, it is strictly an oral tradition and requires a tremendous memory. But the training is not as rigorous here in this country as it is in Africa. So there's a danger of losing some of those stories and some of that information. And maybe not losing the values, but having the values get warped a bit by, American society and culture. So my great-grandfather started collecting the memorabilia. They could be birth certificates and death certificates and land deeds and marriage licenses and so forth. And my grandfather did the same, unfortunately lost them, but my mother then picked up and tried to, and pretty successfully, retrieve some of the documents, or at least copies of them. And, she added photographs. My grandfather added some, and my mother added lots of photographs. So she put them all in a box. And this is a way of helping preserving the family stories, not just orally, but through items. The items have stories themselves, but being able to touch something adds a great deal to knowing fully that our ancestors were real people. Can't see them, but we've got evidence of them. And then when my mother asked me to write the book, she knew that it was time for our family story to take its place among the nation's story. And she also was concerned that if it didn't get written down, that some of those stories could be lost, and that as we sort of got comfortable with who we are as African Americans, and we got farther away from slavery and Jim Crow, and even more recently, the disappointments of the Great Migration, that we could kind of become complacent and just forget. So she assigned me that task.
And along those lines, one theme I saw, or one strand, is this is a story about mothers and daughters, right? There's a really strong matrilineal story here. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the ways that kind of women are passing along these important lessons, and that some of these stories, right, the sexual violence, the story of Betsy kind of in this journey from Tennessee to Texas and the specific accumulations that she faces in that journey. The stories your mother taught you kind of growing up, and how you tried to kind of talk about the relationship Kareem had with John Madison, and does that constitute rape? I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you tell this, how the story's been passed along between mothers and daughters, and what ways there were specific silences because there were certain things that maybe women didn't talk about in the Jim Crow era.
Well, you're right. The relationship between mothers and daughters has been important throughout my family. So when Mandy brought up Kareem, she taught her daughter to be fighting mad, as a way to get through being enslaved, as a way of dealing with some of the things that happened to them. Yes, they were both raped. Mandy by James Madison Sr., Kareem by James Madison Jr. But they both sort of supported each other in being able to, get through such a horrendous part of slavery. That's just one of the many degradations of slavery, but a very big one and very important one. And then you mentioned, Elizabeth, and she was, just for my audience who may not have had a chance to read the book, she was my great grandmother. She was married to Emmanuel Madison, who was actually the descendant from President James Madison. And what you were referring to was they were in Tennessee, and suddenly the whole family was put onto a wagon to be taken to Texas so that they could take advantages of all this great soil for growing cotton and getting rich, where tobacco was sort of declining. And during that trip, there were no provisions made for their personal needs, especially for the only woman on the trip, who was Elizabeth. So, she came with 4 boys, but she was the only female. And, when she had her period, it was just humiliating, embarrassing. And she was embarrassed in front of her sons and humiliated before the driver and a man who was holding a gun on them at all times to keep them quiet. And then moving ahead, there was a very complicated relationship. This is discussed in my book, between my grandmother and my mother. And my grandmother was just, she was in the first generation to be born free, and was very much afraid that if my mother didn't toe the line, didn't do exactly what my grandmother told her to do, she could have something happen to her that was similar to what happened to our enslaved ancestors. And my grandmother's way of protecting my mother was through beating her. So she was physically abusive. And so their relationship was very, very difficult. My mother and I had a much better relationship. She only spanked me once, and I have to admit it, I deserved it that one time. I cut off my hair. But we had a much better relationship. But she and I were very different, and had, especially as I grew older, developed very different views of our places as African-American women. My mother was very proud of descending from an enslaver. That enslaver was President Madison. And I was different because, I called him an enslaver. I called him a rapist. But our views were different because she felt proud that she had this ancestry, and it was important to her for her self-esteem. For me, it was important to recognize what the enslaved women had gone through, the men as well, but especially the enslaved women, and to become proud of that inner strength that enabled them to come through all that they had to go through, which included incest and rape.
No, it is the kind of the clarity and the honesty, the brutality that you kind of bring those stories out is incredibly powerful. And I think that's kind of the difficult task of historical storytelling, right? Kind of bringing those stories to life. Along those lines, I wonder if you could say a little bit. You talked about the journey of this book coming together, right? And this is a book that sees you crossing multiple state lines, multiple archives, different countries, different continents. I wonder how you think about kind of the process of being a historian, right? Using oral history, archival history. We're in a DNA moment and kind of thinking about how scholars use DNA to trace ancestral and familial lineage. What were those eureka moments when you kind of found a document or found information that you said, this really helps the story? This is what I was looking for. This is what I needed. And what were those dead ends that you kind of, you hoped you'd find something in the archive, you'd hoped you'd find something in the sources, and it didn't reveal what you hoped it would reveal?
Well, there were many remarkable documents. The most remarkable one, I think, in terms of documents, was actually found by one of my cousins. I sort of had a small team of people, searching through archives, and that was the 1834 purchase of Elizabeth, whom I have just mentioned, as a mate for Emmanuel. So Emmanuel was owned by Jephthah Billingsley, and Elizabeth was owned by Augustus King, and this was in Gibson County, Tennessee. And Jephthah wanted to find a mate for Emmanuel. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was, just so that he would have more slaves to work for him. I don't know. But he purchased Elizabeth for Emmanuel. And what's so interesting about this document is that Elizabeth and Emmanuel had to be given adequate clothing and food, and their offspring, they call them issues, had to be given adequate clothing and food. Elizabeth and Emmanuel had the choice after a 1-year period of deciding which enslaver they wanted to end up living with. So they chose to end up living with Jephthah Billingsley. But even more interesting is they had the opportunity to decide whether or not they wanted to live with each other. And so it's kind of, to me, it's a unique document because it shows that even though these enslaved people were property, they were still recognized as human beings and given, some important choices in their life. And the other thing that's important about this document is because Elizabeth and Emmanuel did choose to stay together, it's tantamount to a marriage license, which is an extremely rare finding. But in terms of other kinds of, not documents, but my journeys, going to where my ancestors had been was really, really powerful. For example, when I went to the museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and there was a rape there, it was all in wax. Okay, this is the wax, the Great Figures, I think it's called Great Blacks in Wax Museum, and it's in inner city Baltimore. There's a depiction of an enslaved woman being raped. And, I think, that could have been me, at a different time and place. The same thing when I went to Elmina and, was told that the Dutch governor, would have a group of enslaved women brought to the balcony below his window, below his bedroom, so that he could choose which one he wanted to take advantage of. And again, I could see myself in that place. So, these travels were important to me in understanding or trying to understand a vital part of who I am and how I became who I am. I always had the advantage of being safe. I could always walk away. But this was the closest I could become to understanding what my enslaved ancestors had experienced and how those experiences had helped shape me.
No, the journey in itself is a really fascinating journey in the book. And one of those things that you run into as a scholar historian are these questions of dead ends and what you can't fully answer, what you fully can't state. And I think you had a really interesting and creative way of doing that is in the kind of way that you have these interludes where Mandy's story enters the narrative. It reminds me of something the literary scholar Sadia Hartman does, and she talks about imagining a free state and telling an impossible story, right? And kind of trying to kind of cover these interior lives, especially of Black women and girls, in a way that's impossible because the archives were never built to tell those stories. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how your family told the story of Mandy and how you had to kind of discover or recover Mandy, even though she's never appears in any archival sources.
Well, my mother and my grandfather were very cautious about how they described Mandy's story. It's kind of a cleaned up version for their own comfort, I think, largely, and I guess for my protection. But it did not give the whole story. And so, for example, when they talk about my grandfather and my mother talked about what happened between James Madison Sr. and Mandy, they say that he became attracted to her because she could pick cotton so fast. And that when he came to her cabin, he was visiting. And they use the same term when they talk about when James Madison Jr. Raped Corinne. They'd never use that word. And no one in my family would use that word. So my mother would tell me how she would try to find out, well, what really happened? She could never get an answer. They didn't want my aunt, my grandfather, and then my mother, it was just too painful and shameful to talk about. So they talked around it. Is that your question? Am I answering your question?
I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested as a writer, right? And you kind of want to tell these stories. You talk about Mandy in Africa. You talk about the slave ship. You talk about seasoning. How did you make those choices? How did you creatively speculate about Mandy's interior life, what she was going through, her hopes, her dreams, her fears, her fantasies? How did you, as a writer, how did you make those decisions?
Well, I wanted to get to know Mandy, and that is really why I made those journeys, because Mandy played a strong role in determining who I am. And I came to love her, and I became very close to her, and to the point where I knew what she wanted me to know and what she wanted me to pass on through the book. And those were actually the easiest parts, and certainly the most pleasurable parts, even though some of those parts were really quite painful. just being connected with her was really great experience. And I never heard of her voice, but I always was certain. I knew that I was saying what she was wanting to say. And it was a great privilege and joy to enable her to speak for herself. And those are my favorite parts of the book. And I don't think of them as fiction. I just think of them as her words.
Right. This is the task, right? And as historians, we are increasingly aware that the archive doesn't contain everything, right? And in fact, the archive might erase and silence as much as it reveals. Along those lines, right? This is a book that's about this tension between history and memory, and this is something that more and more scholars are really interested in. I'm wondering, I read this and I immediately think of Annette Gordon-Reed thinking about the Hemmings and Monticello, but also Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project. And I wonder how you see yourself in conversation with this larger national reckoning with these questions of enslavement, with white supremacy, in particular, the relationship that our founders, these great thinkers on these questions of liberty, limited government, kind of the American project that we put on a mountaintop and valorize and venerate. But it's also got this other side that in high school classrooms and college classrooms, many of our students are not prepared to hear, and many in the United States are not ready, are uncomfortable talking about the relationship that Madison and Jefferson have with enslaved people.
You mentioned two words at the beginning of your question, and that was history and memory. And then there's a third word, heritage. I once attended a talk at Montpelier. It was given by Christy Coleman, and I'm probably getting her title wrong, but she was director of the history of the Civil War Museum, I believe. And she gave a talk at Montpelier, and she said that history is what actually happened. Heritage is what people latch on to, what matters to them in their communities. And memory, those are the intimate stories, your oral history, what your family talks about and believes. And I had sort of a follow-up conversation through email with Christy Coleman, and I think we disagree on one point. And I said to her that I don't think history is ever really what happened, because it's always told from the point of view of the person who records it. There's rarely any kind of cameras, and if there were cameras, they'd have to have multiple angles, and I just feel that history is never really accurate. And she disagreed, but I do agree with her about what heritage and memory are. And heritage leads to some of the problems that we're having in the country now. The people latch on to parts of history, if you will, those parts that they want to believe in, or those parts that are just sort of part of their communities. It's what they choose to believe in, and I think that's part of what the problems that are going on in the country now. And then memory, as I said, are the oral histories within families. And for me, the oral histories that our families have and passed down for generations to generation are really the most important to us as individual human beings, because they really tell where we came from, who we came from. The stories sort of make your ancestors alive, and they really inform you how those ancestors helped shape you. And so my role now, I think, is to add to what we call history. Now, my part that I'm adding to our nation's history was taken from my own camera. Me holding the camera, my saying what I want to add to the national narrative. And for heritage, it's what I want and hope that African Americans can come to grab onto in terms of the events that happened before them and that are happening to them now. And as I said, oral history, are the intimate stories that really tell us our place, our individual place on America's landscape and how we got there. So I think that answers just part of your question. Can you sort of repeat some of the other parts?
Right. I'll move. I think we have probably about 5 more minutes for questions before I want to open up to the room. But I think I want to read a passage that kind of connects to that point that you mentioned about history, heritage, and memory. And this is on page 239 of your book. The stories of my family kept alive, and those that other African American families kept alive, have evolved from memory to heritage, and now can emerge as history, a more inclusive and complete history. And I think that's, in some ways, maybe the other side of that question, right? How do we reckon with a Jefferson or a Madison as both an architect of this idea of American liberty, but also, right, kind of being fundamentally a part of this structure that writes in enslaved people as other persons in the Constitution, right? Kind of Jefferson, on the one hand, all men created equal. On the other hand, kind of the notes on the state of Virginia, right? Kind of deeply enshrining these ideas of people of African descent as being inferior and incapable for self-government. Just one last question, and then I'll open it up for the audience. You have a refrain that you use over and over, and you mentioned in your introduction. Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from slaves and African slaves and the president. I wonder if you could say what that phrase meant growing up, what it meant when you were first hearing it, and now that you've written this book, what does that phrase mean to you now? How do you understand that kind of family mantra, that family phrase, both the beginning of your life and kind of having gone on this journey and written this kind of long, important history? How do you understand that mantra now?
Well, I was 5 years old when I first heard it. And often I would hear it when I was kind of being squirmy or uncooperative in some way. And so when my mother would say, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. She was trying to get me to behave. And so, she was setting up a standard and giving me, when she told the stories, she sort of filled in how that standard came to be and why it was important to behave in a way that would give honor to this credo. And then, as I grew up, the credo, was inspiring. It did guide me into always doing the best that I could. I had come from a president, and I had come from enslaved people who had done everything they could to make the most of the opportunities available to them. So I should certainly do the same. But, when I became the griot, I began to face the fact that within this credo that encourages pride and inspiration, there's a message of slavery and the abuse of slavery and incest. And especially as I did my research, I became very proud of my enslaved ancestors. And that is, what, I want to contribute. And, I do recognize that I have some pride in descending from President Madison because, he helped found this country. He certainly helped write the Constitution, which our country strongly relies upon. But, he was a flawed individual, as we all are. And I became angry with him. And, I try to balance the two, the pride and the anger, but, now that I really understand what he did, to my enslaved ancestors, particularly to the women, I'm afraid that the anger sort of overshadows the pride.
And there's righteousness in anger, right? That anger can lead the way. I want to say thank you again, Dr. Kearse, for this really rich, deeply researched, and intimate book. I'll open the room for questions. I believe so. Kind of the folks behind the scenes have some questions in the queue. Let's give the room a shot to kind of jump in.
Yeah, it looks like we've already got a really good question from Alyssa, and written from a Black perspective, saying, because warped white supremacist perspectives of history inform much of the self-identified Southern culture among white people, what can we as Black people do to better reach them, white people, with stories like yours?
Well, I mean, we can listen, we could be honest, we can not use words like visiting when, we're talking about rape. We can recognize the many magnificent contributions slaves and slave descendants have made to our country. Dr. Bland, do you have more ideas?
I mean, I think the honesty and truth-telling matters. Some of these are conversations white people need to have with each other, right? Understanding and being honest about what your own family histories could potentially entail. I mean, fighting for African-American history to be included in broader historical curriculums. Having a kind of honest conversations about what the kind of afterlife of slavery might look like in the forms of mass incarceration, the racial wealth gap, racial health disparities. I mean, African Americans have been doing this truth telling for a long time, right? And I think white folks also have to do this truth telling within communities where sometimes we're not there, right? Kind of in families, in country clubs, in kind of these other spaces.
It's an important question.
Here's another one from Holly, saying, what advice would you give to young Black writers who might want to join the project of correcting our historical narrative?
Well, do your research, tell your own stories, share those stories. I think, though, the main thing is to do the research, and that is a lot easier said than done. But our stories are there. It's a difficult matter to find them, but it's important and worthy endeavor. I would say, don't give up. Hone your writing skills. Just recognize that those stories, are important. Whatever you can add to complete the national narrative are important.
And also recognize that this is a tradition, right? Sometimes it requires a tremendous amount of courage to confront the past, but you're not the first person. Your voice matters, and you can add something new. But there's also you're on the shoulders of giants, right? There are folks who are guiding the light, leaving those breadcrumbs to help you tell these stories. Also, come get a PhD at the University of Tennessee. We want you to hear the writing alongside us.
All right, we've got a fellow history professor, Bob Hutton, coming in with a question. Do y'all think that heritage might be a category of understanding different from historians discusses memory? Kind of alluding to Betty's 3 categories there.
Is it different from, I suppose that memory, or, memories that are told and shared and treasured within individual families are within a broader heritage, within the African American community in an immediate way, in an immediate geographical way, and in a broader, both geographical and historical and social and cultural way that sort of defines, the African American story. So it's sort of like a quilt. The African American heritage, and probably heritages of other groups as well, is like a quilt of memories that all come together, to create a whole sense of heritage.
Yeah, this is a whole rabbit hole, right? Historians are kind of queasy with memory in itself, right? And kind of production of memory happening outside of academic spaces, right? And therefore sometimes think that it's therefore untrustworthy, or right, therefore not worthy of academic study. Heritage, right, gets us into these questions of ancestry, familial ties, right? In the South, we kind of, I can still remember the kind of phrase, it's heritage, not hate, when kind of white Southerners speak to the kind of legacy of the Confederate States of America. And right, that in itself, right, is dissipating. But the kind of structure of heritage, right, is something that's to be taken seriously, but is also something that is kind of accepted uncritically, right? I think memory, you think about memory being contested, right, and kind of competing memory and collective memory, where heritage is the kind of the something that the group decides, and therefore, if you're within the group, you accept that heritage. Otherwise, you might be cast as an outsider. You might be in some ways a traitor. And I think that, communal belonging and kind of in-group versus out-group often depends on these categories of heritage.
I think we're still waiting on another official question, but I know we had some thank yous coming through. Alyssa, who had the first comment, said thank you so much for being with us. And Rhea said thank you. your story and conversation today is turning the best way to turn memories into history. Adding a bit to that dialogue we have going.
Dr. Kearse, if you don't mind, I'll ask you another question. I just got finished teaching a class on slavery and a class on the Great Migration. So we're kind of in this midst of this discussion about enslavement and kind of how we understand the kind of resilience and creativity of enslaved people. But your story is very much a Great Migration story. And as someone who thinks a lot about emancipation and Reconstruction, I'm wondering kind of how you think about your Texas roots and kind of the kind of story of Cedar Creek. And I think you mentioned he had an uncle who had to leave town. My family's from Tallahassee. I have stories in my family of people in that era, 1880s, getting into a conflict with a white Southerner and having to disappear and never come to town again. I wonder how you kind of think about that memory, right? The kind of the Jim Crow South to the Great Migration. And I detect a little Great Migration pessimism, or the sense that the Great Migration doesn't end up being the promised land, and right, the kind of thinking about Isabel Wilkerson and the various scholars and thinkers who are telling that story.
Well, I do have stories within every era that have been passed down to me. So the story during Jim Crow about my my grandfather's brother having to leave town and change his name from Charlie Madison to John Miller is one of those stories that it's told again and again. And I've met his grandchildren and gotten a chance to know them and discuss how this affected them, having known that their own father was in danger, and our grandfather was in danger of being lynched. So we still have that story as part of our memory. And my own paternal grandfather had to leave town, and he was part of the Great Migration because he pulled a gun for good reason on some white boys who were bothering his sons. He had to uproot himself, leave his medical practice, and move from Louisiana to California. We all have these stories, and to the people who are asking about writing, find those stories and please write them and make them part of the national narrative, part of what we're calling history.
I think that's critical, right? I mean, these stories are family stories, but they're the story of America, right? We're a nation that's been on the move. We tell the kind of mythic story of a nation of immigrants, and I mean, certainly kind of enslaved people didn't choose to migrate here, but African Americans in the Jim Crow South took everything that they knew, the world that they knew, and sought out the warmth of another sun, right? Kind of sought out a world that they had no idea, but knew that any world had to be better than where they were. I mean, right, kind of telling those stories, writing those stories into existence helps us understand the promise and peril of their journeys.
It's like we actually have a question that's kind of personal for you, Bettye, is who will be the next griot in your family? Have you chosen? Has it happened?
Well, I don't have to make a choice because I only have one child. And that is my daughter, Nicole, who lives in London, but who knows the stories and who is ready to take up the mantle, ready to become in charge of the box. And she has 2 children, so she will have to make a decision about who will become the 10th generation griot, because I have a grandson, or griot, my granddaughter. My daughter will just have to decide which one. And I hope that there's an 11th and 12th and 13th and 14th and on generation African-American griot or griot in my family.
It makes me kind of want to ask around, I know we don't want to talk too much about memory and the accuracy of it, because it's, this story that you've unfurled is just, it's a wonderful story. It's your story. It's, it's true in so many ways. But I wonder what you think. Do you think that history would be improved if more traditions carried sort of an oral history passing like your family has done? Because like the way I've experienced it with family, it's always who is most interested in the genealogy, who's willing to do the work to keep up with it, versus knowing that there is going to be the tradition expected, that those stories will be handed down. I guess, has it served your family in a way that you think it could serve other families, I guess?
Yes, it has served my family very, very well. So in each generation, one person is appointed this responsibility. And that person has the responsibility of appointing the next person. And so they have to tell the stories, save the stories, save the items in the box, take good care of it so it doesn't get lost again, add to the box, add to the stories, choose the next person. And the box should be kept in someplace special, someplace safe. And I was going to say something else, and I kind of lost my train of thought. But it's also important to get the children involved in the stories, and have them do family treasure hunts and find items that and then find the stories. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It's okay. So I've written a book, but it's also perfectly fine, I feel, to record them. To use an audio recorder, and I think that's a wonderful idea to actually hear people speaking. I did a little of that with my parents and wish I had done much, much more. That really helps keep them alive. But the key is assigning some person to be responsible for the stories in the box.
And they have to kind of want to do it.
They may not get the choice. My daughter is happy to do it, but it's so important.
Mm-hmm.
Because the stories will get lost.
We had another question that's kind of related to this. Kristen asked, how was writing the story healing for your family? Or on the other end, did it raise some old wounds? You talked about having some disagreements with your mother. Did it raise any old wounds that you hadn't openly discussed before?
I think it was healing. I mean, I think it's healing to get the whole story out. And my mother wasn't by any means angry with me that, I used the term rape. She was uncomfortable with it, but she wasn't angry with me for using that and even applying it to President Madison. But, it's just healing to tell the whole story and, come as close to the whole truth as you can. I haven't really had any backlash from my family, even in some of the older generations. I think, my generation and the younger are more comfortable, hearing some of the painful experiences that our ancestors had. And I mean, just getting it out there, not holding it in, facing it, I think is healing.
I have one question that technical difficulties couldn't get it through the chat, but it was emailed to me. So I'm going to pose that real quick. And it's not going to show up on the screen, so you'll just have to bear with me listening. Georgina Vines asked, she's curious whether Montpelier is now telling the story of enslaved people who worked and lived there, because she's been there twice, and interest was around Madison, believed to have written the First Amendment there, guaranteeing the freedom of the press. But she doesn't remember seeing any recognition of that at the time. I'm assuming she's referring to the enslaved, discussion of enslaved people at Montpelier. But how does that tie in your awareness and your research with Madison and freedom of the press and the First Amendment?
I'm not aware of where the First Amendment was actually written. But at Montpelier now, there is a wonderful permanent exhibit. It's been there about 3 years. And it's called A Mere Distinction of Color. And it's about the role that African Americans played on the plantation, the important roles that they played, how important they were to James Madison, and especially how their presence, their labor, enabled him to go off to what is now called Princeton University and study political theory and come up with the Constitution, or well, the elements of the Constitution. And that exhibit also discusses how enslaved people are addressed in the Constitution. So there are 7 or 8 articles in the Constitution that deal directly with enslaved people. But I would encourage everyone to go and see this exhibit because it's about Montpelier and James Madison, but it's also about how important enslaved people were in shaping what this country became. So, I mean, they're facing their history, and they're doing a very fine job of it. This exhibit has won awards. It's a very truthful exhibit.
Yeah, Georgina saying that's exactly what I wanted to know, answered the question. So we've got one more question, which is kind of specific that we're going to get to, and then I'll toss it back and see if Dr. Bland has any last thoughts to sort of wrap up the interview. Larice says, I'm a descendant of Barilla Madison, who may be the granddaughter of Shadrach Madison. How much stock do you put in DNA research versus following a paper trail to confirm familial connections? Obviously, this is very directly related to your search. So,
yes, I know about Barilla, and I certainly know about Shadrach. And so Larice Jones and I are cousins because there is a genetic connection between Shadrach Madison and his descendants and my family. And, I'm doing more work on that right now. I'm working with a genetic genealogist whose name is Shannon Christmas to, just really get more information about that genetic connection. So, I mean, they're both important. DNA research is important. Following a paper trail as best you can is important. Both are difficult. I think maybe the paper trail is even more difficult. But, it all kind of comes together along with the oral history to tell you, your family history. So I just met a cousin.
Great.
I love it when we events turn into family reunions. That's the best type of it. We now do the electric slide.
Oh.
But this has been a pleasure and a delight. Very rich and informative. And I want to thank you for writing this book and sharing it with us. I want to thank Union Books for helping organize this event. Want to thank the University of Tennessee Library, the Black Alumni Society, the UT Alumni Society for helping to organize this event. Thank you for everyone for tuning in. I know we're all a little Zoom fatigued at this point of the year, but hopefully you got something that you weren't going to get anywhere else on TV land this evening. Thank you again to everyone for coming out to the event.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It's a wonderful event and beautifully organized. I've done a number of Zoom events for different organizations, and this one is by far the most well organized.
Well, that's great to hear. We hope to keep doing them. I would be unfair of me not to mention that there is a book that you can buy and you can read more if you haven't already read this story. It's in. I don't have a copy on hand because our copies that we had were sold out, which is a good thing. But we can order them in very quickly. So if you go to the link at unionavebooks.com and search the Other Madisons, you should be able to find it. Help Bettye keep doing her research. I think it sounds like she's on an incredible journey, and I'm so excited to add that to my library as a part of this broader conversation about changing the history and changing our memory. So thank you.
I'm glad you put up that link because it's also important for us to support our independent bookstores. They are really struggling, and they have been so important to our communities.
We want to all be back here every year, doing the same, if not more events and more conversations, meeting more cousins, right? So, thank you all. I don't know if Casey or anyone from the Hodges Society wanted to say goodbye, but I've really enjoyed tonight. So thank you all so much for coming out.
And thank you.